Every single day, millions of people wake up and repeat the exact same patterns that make them miserable. The woman who swears she will not date another narcissist falls for the same type of man within months. The man who promises to control his anger explodes at his children again. The employee who hates their toxic workplace finds themselves in identical situations at every new job. You know this pattern. You have lived this pattern. Despite your intelligence, despite your good intentions, you find yourself trapped in cycles of suffering that seem impossible to break. Here is what nobody tells you about this nightmare. It is not random. It is not bad luck. It is not because the world is against you. There is one specific psychological law that governs why this happens. And once you understand it, everything changes. This law was discovered by a Swiss psychiatrist who spent decades studying the human mind. His name was Carl Jung, and what he found will disturb you. It will challenge everything you believe about yourself. But more importantly, it will finally explain why you keep suffering and, more crucially, how to stop. The truth Jung uncovered is so powerful that governments, corporations, and institutions have built entire systems around keeping you ignorant. Because when you understand this law, you become very difficult to control. You stop being predictable. You stop being manipulatable. You stop being a victim of your own unconscious patterns. But understanding this law requires courage. It demands that you look at parts of yourself you have spent your entire life avoiding. It asks you to question not just your actions, but the very foundation of who you think you are. Most people will never take this journey. They will continue suffering, wondering why life keeps repeating the same painful lessons. They will blame others, blame circumstances, blame everything except the one thing that actually has the power to change their reality. The question is, are you ready to learn what that one thing is? Before we dive into the individual psychology that traps you in suffering, we need to understand how this same law operates on a massive scale. Because what Jung discovered about personal psychology also explains the darkest chapters in human history. Consider Nazi Germany. How did an entire nation of educated, civilized people become complicit in genocide? The standard explanation focuses on economic hardship and charismatic leadership. But Jung saw something deeper. He saw a collective refusal to acknowledge the capacity for evil that exists within every human being. The Germans convinced themselves they were the superior race, the moral exemplars, the victims of injustice. They projected all their darkness, all their capacity for cruelty and hatred onto the Jews, the Roma, the disabled, and other groups. By refusing to acknowledge their own potential for evil, they became possessed by it. This was not unique to Germany. Look at the Soviet Union under Stalin. Millions died while the population convinced itself they were building a utopian society. The darkness they refused to see in their system and themselves got projected onto enemies of the people, kulaks, intellectuals, anyone who questioned the narrative. Examine American slavery. How did a nation founded on the principles of liberty and equality justify owning other human beings for centuries? By projecting their own moral failures onto their victims. Slaves were portrayed as less than human, savage, incapable of freedom. This projection allowed slaveholders to maintain their self-image as righteous Christians while perpetrating unspeakable cruelty. The pattern repeats throughout history because the psychological mechanism is universal. When groups refuse to acknowledge their capacity for wrongdoing, that unacknowledged darkness does not disappear. It grows in the shadows of consciousness until it explodes in ways far more destructive than if it had been faced directly. Jung watched this unfold in real time during World War II. He saw how collective denial created collective possession by the very forces being denied. The more a group insisted on its purity and righteousness, the more likely it was to commit atrocities while remaining blind to its own evil. This historical pattern reveals the law we are exploring. What you refuse to acknowledge about yourself does not disappear. It goes underground into what Jung called the shadow, where it gains power over you precisely because you refuse to see it. Nations that deny their capacity for evil become evil. Individuals who deny their capacity for destructive behavior become destructive. The mechanism is identical, whether we are talking about a person or a civilization. Carl Gustav Jung was not just another psychiatrist. He was a man who dared to look into the depths of human consciousness and report back what he found, regardless of how uncomfortable it made people. Born in Switzerland in 1875, Jung initially followed the path laid out by his mentor, Sigmund Freud. But Jung possessed something that would ultimately separate him from Freud and most of his contemporaries: an uncompromising commitment to truth over comfort. While Freud focused on sexual repression as the root of psychological problems, Jung saw something far more comprehensive and disturbing. He noticed that his patients consistently struggled with parts of themselves they refused to acknowledge. The kind, gentle woman who insisted she never felt anger would sabotage every relationship through passive aggression. The successful businessman, who prided himself on his integrity, would lie reflexively about small matters. Jung realized these were not random quirks or moral failings. They were manifestations of a universal psychological law. Every person contains aspects of themselves that they find unacceptable, and these rejected aspects form what he called the shadow. The breakthrough came through his own brutal self-examination. After his split with Freud in 1913, Jung entered what he called his confrontation with the unconscious. For years, he deliberately engaged with the parts of himself he had always avoided: his capacity for cruelty, his petty jealousies, his grandiose fantasies. What he discovered changed everything. The more he acknowledged and integrated these shadow aspects, the more genuinely powerful and free he became. Conversely, the more people denied their shadows, the more those shadows controlled their lives from the unconscious. Jung tested this insight with thousands of patients over decades. The results were consistent and shocking. People who refused to acknowledge their shadow aspects were dominated by them. The person who denied their selfishness became unconsciously manipulative. The individual who rejected their aggressive nature would either become a victim repeatedly or explode in inappropriate rage. But those who had the courage to face their shadows experienced something remarkable: genuine transformation. Not the superficial behavior modification that most people call change, but fundamental shifts in their relationship with themselves and reality. Jung had discovered something that most people spend their entire lives trying to avoid. You cannot heal what you will not acknowledge. You cannot change what you refuse to see. You cannot integrate what you continuously reject. This was not just psychological theory for Jung. It was a roadmap for human liberation that demanded everything from those brave enough to follow it. Your shadow is not some mystical concept. It is the collection of every aspect of your personality that you have decided is unacceptable. Every trait, impulse, desire, or capacity that you have judged as bad, wrong, or inappropriate gets pushed into the unconscious realm Jung called the shadow. Here is how your shadow formed. As a child, you quickly learned which parts of yourself were welcomed and which were rejected. When you expressed anger, maybe you were punished or told, "Good children do not get angry." When you showed selfishness, you might have been shamed with, "Do not be so selfish." When you displayed your natural aggressive or competitive nature, you were perhaps told to be nice or play fair. Each time you received these messages, you faced a choice: integrate these aspects of yourself consciously, or reject them to maintain approval and safety. Most children, reasonably, choose safety. They begin to deny and repress the aspects of themselves that cause problems. But here is what nobody tells you: these rejected aspects do not disappear. They go underground, forming your shadow. And from The unconscious, they begin to run your life in ways you cannot see or control. The shadow operates through several mechanisms, but the most common is unconscious compensation. If you have rejected your aggressive nature, you might find yourself repeatedly in situations where you are victimized by aggressive people. If you have denied your selfishness, you might compulsively give to others while secretly resenting them for not appreciating your sacrifice. Your shadow also manifests through projection. You will find yourself intensely bothered by people who display the very qualities you have rejected in yourself. The person who has pushed down their dishonesty will be obsessed with calling out liars. The individual who has denied their neediness will be irritated by clingy people. Most significantly, your shadow creates repetitive patterns in your life. You will unconsciously seek out situations and relationships that force you to confront your rejected aspects, because the psyche is always trying to achieve wholeness. But since you refuse to acknowledge these aspects consciously, you experience these encounters as external problems rather than internal healing opportunities. Consider the woman who says she values kindness above all else, but keeps attracting cruel partners. Her shadow contains her own capacity for cruelty, which she has rejected. She unconsciously seeks relationships with people who will express this rejected aspect, allowing her to experience it vicariously while maintaining her self-image as purely kind. Or examine the man who prides himself on being rational and logical, but finds himself in emotionally chaotic situations repeatedly. His shadow contains his emotional nature, which he has deemed unacceptable. His unconscious draws him toward emotional intensity because his psyche knows he needs integration, but he experiences this as external drama rather than internal completion. Your shadow is not evil. It is not something to be destroyed or permanently suppressed. It contains not only your capacity for destruction, but also tremendous creative power, passion, and authenticity that you have rejected along with the negative traits. The shadow is your hidden self that rules your life precisely because it is hidden. What you do not acknowledge consciously will control you unconsciously. Projection is the shadow's most powerful weapon, and it is the mechanism that keeps most people trapped in suffering for their entire lives. When you project, you see your own rejected qualities in other people and react to them as if they were external threats rather than internal aspects of yourself. Every intense emotional reaction you have to another person is telling you something about your own shadow. The qualities that trigger you most strongly in others are almost always qualities you possess but refuse to acknowledge in yourself. Think about the people who annoy you most. What specific behaviors or traits do they display that make your blood boil? Write them down. Now consider this disturbing truth. You possess every single one of those qualities. The intensity of your reaction is directly proportional to how strongly you have rejected that aspect of yourself. This is not popular psychology or feel-good spirituality. This is the harsh reality of how the human psyche operates. You cannot be triggered by something you do not carry within yourself. The person who has genuinely integrated their own capacity for dishonesty might notice lying in others, but they will not have an intense emotional reaction to it because they are not fighting their own dishonest impulses. Projection creates a vicious cycle that keeps you suffering. Instead of dealing with your own rejected aspects, you focus on trying to change or avoid other people who mirror those aspects back to you. This is why you keep attracting the same types of problematic people and situations. Your unconscious is trying to heal you by forcing you to confront your projections. But you keep interpreting these encounters as evidence that the world is full of terrible people. Consider romantic relationships where projection operates most intensely. In the beginning, you often project your positive qualities onto your partner, seeing them as the embodiment of everything wonderful. This is why new love feels so intoxicating. You are literally falling in love with yourself reflected in another person. But as the relationship develops, negative projection begins. You start seeing your rejected qualities in your partner. They become too needy if you have denied your own needs. They become controlling if you have rejected your own desire for control. They become selfish if you have suppressed your own healthy selfishness. The relationship becomes a battlefield where you are fighting aspects of yourself that you refuse to acknowledge. Most relationships end when the projections become too intense for either person to handle. But the pattern repeats with the next partner because you bring your unintegrated shadow into every relationship. Projection operates in all areas of life. In your career, you might find yourself constantly frustrated with incompetent colleagues, never recognizing your own areas of incompetence. In your family, you might be triggered by relatives who are dramatic while remaining blind to your own dramatic tendencies. On a societal level, projection creates the us versus them mentality that fuels conflict, war, and social division. Groups project their collective shadows onto other groups, seeing them as the source of all problems while maintaining their own righteousness. The most insidious aspect of projection is that it feels completely real. When you are projecting, you genuinely believe that the problem is out there in the other person or group. You can present evidence, make logical arguments, and rally support for your position. But none of this changes the fundamental reality. You are fighting yourself and losing. The systems that govern modern society are built on your refusal to acknowledge your shadow. Governments, corporations, media organizations, and institutions of all kinds profit from keeping you unconscious of your rejected aspects, because unconscious people are predictable, manipulatable, and profitable. Consider how political systems exploit projection. Politicians do not win elections by helping you integrate your shadow. They win by becoming screens for your projections. They promise to fight the bad people who embody your rejected qualities while presenting themselves as the embodiment of your idealized self-image. If you have rejected your own aggression, you will support politicians who promise to be aggressive toward your enemies. If you have denied your own greed, you will rally behind leaders who claim to fight against greedy people. You are not actually addressing the root of societal problems. You are participating in collective projection that keeps the real issues unconscious and unresolved. The media understands this psychology and exploits it ruthlessly. News organizations do not make money by helping you become conscious. They profit by keeping you in a state of emotional reactivity. They present stories that trigger your projections, keeping you focused on external enemies rather than internal integration. Social media platforms are projection amplification systems. They create algorithms designed to show you content that triggers strong emotional reactions, which are almost always projections. You scroll through feeds getting angry at people who display your rejected qualities, feeling righteous in your judgment while remaining unconscious of your own shadow. Aspects. Consumer culture is built on shadow exploitation. Advertising does not sell you products. It sells you the promise of avoiding or transcending your rejected aspects. Beauty products promise to help you avoid acknowledging your insecurities. Luxury goods promise to help you deny your feelings of inadequacy. Self-help courses promise quick fixes that let you bypass the difficult work of shadow integration. The therapeutic and spiritual industries often participate in this exploitation. Many therapeutic approaches focus on managing symptoms rather than integrating shadow aspects. Popular spirituality often promotes positive thinking and good vibes only, attitudes that encourage further shadow rejection rather than genuine integration. Even educational systems contribute by teaching you to think about yourself and others in simplistic categories of good and bad, right and wrong, without acknowledging the complexity and contradictions that exist within every human being. The result is a society of people who are unconscious of their own psychology. reactive to their projections, and dependent on external systems for their sense of identity and security. This makes them ideal consumers, voters, and workers, but terrible at creating genuine change or finding authentic fulfillment. The most sophisticated manipulation occurs when systems present themselves as helping you fight your shadow projections. The diet industry profits from your rejection of your relationship with food and your body. The relationship industry profits from your projection of responsibility for your happiness onto romantic partners. The productivity industry profits from your rejection of your natural rhythms and human limitations. These systems do not want you to integrate your shadow because integrated people are difficult to manipulate. They know themselves too well to be easily triggered. They take responsibility for their own psychology rather than projecting it onto external targets. They cannot be controlled through fear, shame, or promises of avoiding discomfort. Your unconsciousness is not just a personal problem. It is the foundation of societal systems that depend on your continued suffering and reactivity. Shadow integration is not about becoming a better person or fixing your flaws. It is about becoming a whole person who acknowledges and takes responsibility for the full spectrum of their humanity. This process requires courage, honesty, and a willingness to shatter your idealized self-image. The first step is recognition. You must learn to identify when you are projecting. Every time you have an intense emotional reaction to another person, pause and ask yourself, what quality am I seeing in this person that I might possess but refuse to acknowledge in myself? This is not about self-blame or judgment. It is about curiosity and investigation. If someone's dishonesty triggers you intensely, explore your own relationship with truth. Where do you lie to others or yourself? Where do you present false images or withhold important information? The goal is not to shame yourself, but to acknowledge the full spectrum of your capabilities. The second step is ownership. Instead of saying, that person is so selfish, practice saying, I am triggered by this person's selfishness because I have rejected my own selfish tendencies. This simple shift in language moves you from victim consciousness to empowered consciousness. When you own your projections, you stop giving your power away to external circumstances. You recognize that your emotional state is determined by your internal psychology, not by other people's behavior. This does not mean you have to accept mistreatment, but it means you respond from a place of consciousness rather than reactivity. The third step is dialogue. Begin having conscious conversations with your rejected aspects. If you have rejected your anger, spend time understanding what your anger is trying to tell you. Anger often carries important information about boundaries, values, and needs that are not being met. Instead of suppressing it or projecting it, learn to work with it consciously. If you have rejected your selfishness, explore what healthy selfishness might look like. You might discover that what you call selfishness is actually necessary self-care, boundary setting, or personal responsibility that you have been avoiding. The fourth step is integration. This means finding conscious, appropriate ways to express your rejected aspects. If you have rejected your aggressive nature, you might channel it into competitive sports, assertive communication, or passionate advocacy for causes you believe in. If you have rejected your neediness, you might practice asking for help appropriately or acknowledging your interdependence with others. Integration does not mean acting out your shadow unconsciously. It means bringing consciousness to all aspects of yourself so you can choose how to express them appropriately. The integrated person can be aggressive when aggression is called for and gentle when gentleness is appropriate. They can be selfish when self-care is needed and generous when generosity serves everyone. The fifth step is ongoing practice. Shadow work is not a one-time event, but a lifelong process. New projections will emerge as you grow and face new situations. The key is developing the habit of looking inward whenever you find yourself repeatedly triggered by external circumstances. This process is difficult because it requires giving up the comfortable illusion that you are purely good and your problems are caused by purely bad external forces. But this sacrifice leads to genuine freedom, the freedom that comes from knowing and accepting yourself completely. When you integrate your shadow, you stop being a victim of unconscious patterns. You stop attracting the same problematic situations because you are no longer unconsciously seeking out your rejected aspects in others. You become genuinely powerful because your power is no longer leaking through unconscious projections and reactions. When you finally stop running from your shadow and begin the process of integration, everything changes, not just your internal experience, but your entire relationship with reality. First, you discover genuine self-acceptance. Not the shallow self-love promoted by popular culture, but the deep peace that comes from knowing yourself completely. You stop needing to maintain a perfect image because you have acknowledged that perfection was always an illusion. This acceptance extends naturally to others, allowing you to see people clearly without the distortion of projection. Your relationships transform dramatically. Instead of unconsciously seeking people who will carry your rejected aspects, you begin attracting individuals who support your wholeness. Conflicts become opportunities for deeper understanding rather than battles for righteousness. You stop trying to change others because you are no longer fighting aspects of yourself reflected in them. Your emotional reactivity decreases significantly. The people and situations that once triggered intense reactions lose their power over you because you have reclaimed the power you had projected onto them. You respond to challenges from a place of consciousness rather than reacting from unconscious wounds. Your decision-making improves because you are no longer making choices based on what you think you should want or what maintains your idealized self-image. You can acknowledge your actual desires, needs, and values without shame, leading to decisions that genuinely serve your well-being and growth. You become much more difficult to manipulate. Political rhetoric, advertising, and social pressure lose their effectiveness because they depend on triggering your projections and unconscious fears. You can see through attempts to make you react emotionally to external targets rather than addressing internal reality. Your creative and professional life flourishes because you have access to the full spectrum of your psychological resources. The energy that was previously tied up in maintaining false images and fighting projections becomes available for genuine creativity and achievement. Most importantly, you stop suffering in the repetitive, unconscious ways that characterize most human experience. You still face challenges and difficulties, but you no longer create unnecessary suffering through projection, denial, and unconscious reactivity. This transformation does not happen overnight, and it is not always comfortable. Shadow integration requires facing parts of yourself that you have spent years or decades avoiding. It demands that you take responsibility for your role in every problematic pattern in your life. It asks you to give up the victim identity that, while painful, can feel safer than taking full responsibility for your experience. But for those who have the courage to undertake this journey, the rewards are extraordinary. You discover that the very aspects of yourself you thought were your greatest weaknesses often contain your greatest strengths. Your repressed anger might contain your passion and power. Your denied selfishness might contain your ability to set healthy boundaries and take care of yourself. Carl Jung spent his life proving that this transformation is possible, not through positive thinking or behavioral modification, but through the courageous work of facing your complete self and integrating all aspects of your humanity. The choice is yours. You can continue living unconsciously, suffering from the same patterns while blaming external circumstances. Or you can begin the difficult but liberating work of reclaiming the parts of yourself you have rejected and discovering who who you truly are. When you stop running from yourself, the suffering will continue until you learn this one psychological law. What you refuse to acknowledge about yourself will control you from the unconscious. But when you have the courage to face your shadow and integrate it consciously, you finally become free. Your liberation begins the moment you stop pointing outward and start looking within. The very thing you have been running from your entire life is the key to your freedom. Are you ready to stop suffering and start integrating? The shadow you have rejected is waiting for your acknowledgement, and your whole self is waiting for your acceptance. If this exploration has triggered something in you, if you recognize these patterns in your own life, then the process has already begun. Subscribe and share this video with someone who needs to hear this message. Your shadow work is not just personal healing. It is a contribution to the consciousness of humanity itself. The time for running is over. The time for integration has begun.